Well, hello, FCC and beyond. Welcome to episode 11 of Text Messages, which is a podcast out of First Christian Church of Huntington Beach. My name is Stephen Pate. I'm on our digital engagement team of the church. I'm joined with our lead pastor, Scott Martin. Scott, so good to see you, man. Thanks for being here.
Hey, you too, man. Good to see you too. Hey, I know we're going to dive into this, but I have one quick question for you.
Okay.
How excited are you about March Madness?
Woo! I am really excited. I missed it so much last year. I'm a huge college basketball fan, but the thing is, the team that I really like, the Duke Blue Devils, they have not been doing very well this year. So I don't even know if they're going to make the tournament, but it'll still be good.
Is this the year Gonzaga is finally going to win it all?
You know what? They have an awesome team, and they've been looking good for a number of years. So that's possible. I feel like they always get really close, and they just don't quite, cross that threshold of getting, I think they made it to the championship, though, a couple years ago. So they've gotten close, but we'll see.
No.
I don't know. Are you pulling for USC? I know you like USC football. I don't know if you're invested in basketball.
College basketball, I like college basketball. I don't follow it really closely. Like if there's a fun game on, I'll watch it. And sometimes March Madness games are fun to watch, but I'm not like diehard basketball. I just like to watch good. I just like the tournament to be good and entertaining and competitive.
Yeah, for sure. And it has all that that emotion, right? You never know what's going to happen. And I just love the Cinderella teams that come out of nowhere and they do the upset. I mean, I just feel like I have something for the underdogs. So that always gives me joy to see that happen. Unless it's the team I like, then it's like, okay, it's a little devastating. Well, awesome. Well, yeah, I'm excited for that. But today we're going to continue talking a little bit about some church traditions. And so in our previous episode, we talked about Lent, and Lent is this time of reflection that the church has had traditionally just to prepare for Easter. So we talked a little bit about what that kind of looks like for us, even if we're a part of a tradition that doesn't necessarily like have a big tie into that, but just kind of what we do as followers of Jesus to reflect on that. And so today I thought we could enter into a conversation about a really fascinating part of Scripture in the Gospels, which is sort of the final week of Jesus's life, leading up to his death and then his resurrection. It's a time normally called Holy Week. And there's a lot in that. And so we'll get to that. But I thought we could start with just sort of the beginning and kind of trace some of those things that are happening. And the first thing that we come to that really is a part of this time period is called Palm Sunday. And that's the Sunday before Easter, where we see Jesus coming into Jerusalem. And there's a lot there. So I thought we could start there, Scott. And if you could just provide a little context, a little insight into what's happening, and then we'll kind of dive into some of the messages that we find in that text.
Yeah. So Palm Sunday, like you said, it begins the last week of Jesus' life, and he's on his way to Jerusalem for a very specific reason. He's going to celebrate the Passover, which the Passover is a huge, huge holiday within Judaism. It was in the first century. It still is now. Mm-hmm. Really, Passover is, for Jewish people, it's their national holiday. It would be equivalent to like the 4th of July for those of us that live in the United States, because the Passover is this holiday that celebrates the story of the Exodus, which is really the defining moment for the nation of Israel, when God sends Moses into Egypt, and Moses ultimately leads the people out of slavery in Egypt. And the story ends, 40 years later, when they settle down in the land of Israel and become the nation of Israel. And in the midst of all that, it's when God gives them the law. It's when they get their identity. So it's really their celebration of like their nation and their people. It's one of 3 what are called pilgrimage festivals, where good Jews from all over the place would make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to the temple, to celebrate. The other 2 festivals are tabernacles, or sometimes it's called booths, and then Pentecost is the other one. But those were pilgrimage festivals where if you were able to, and if you were Jew, you would make that pilgrimage. So this is why Jesus is going to Jerusalem. He's going there to celebrate the Passover. And he comes riding in to Jerusalem at the beginning of the last week of his life. He comes riding on a donkey, which seems kind of weird for us. Yeah. But if you go back in the Old Testament in Israel, a donkey is a royal animal. Like the kings would ride on donkeys. Like there's stories of the Old Testament kings that would come riding on a donkey, which again, doesn't seem real regal to us. We would tend to think of maybe like a great stallion or something.
Yeah, like a horse. Yeah, something more majestic. Huh?
Yeah. So it's kind of a weird picture for us to think about. But in the tradition of the people of Israel, it's pretty significant. Again, it's a royal animal. It's what the king would ride in on. And so Jesus, as he's coming into Jerusalem to get ready to celebrate the Passover, he comes in riding on a donkey, and there's this whole parade that greets him.
Mm.
And there's people waving palm branches, and they're laying their cloaks in the street, and they're shouting Hosanna. And it's this big like celebration as he's getting there, and people are trying to Hosanna. The word Hosanna literally means like save us or rescue us. And in the Jewish tradition, it's like a praise. It's like a cry of praise, like God rescue us, God save us. And so this whole parade in is really significant because it's people, Jesus is pictured as a king riding in on a donkey, and people are shouting, save us, save us. And ultimately what they're asking for salvation for at this point is from the Romans, the oppression of the Romans.
Okay.
Yeah, because they're still not an independent nation. So it's like, hey, we want to be free. We want to be free of the burden and the oppression of Rome. So save us, rescue us. And the whole thing, that whole scene that happens on Palm Sunday is very, very reminiscent of this event that's known as the Maccabean Revolt. And Maccabees it goes back to, I think 167 is the year 167 BC is the year the Maccabean Revolt happens.
So is that like kind of between Old Testament and New Testament time period? Is that what we're looking at?
Yeah, okay. It's pretty close to about the middle of that like intertestamental period.
Okay.
And a lot of us might be familiar with Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, builds this huge empire and conquers everything. And he's Greek. And so everywhere his empire goes, Greek culture goes, Greek religion goes. It's what's known as Hellenization. After Alexander dies, his empire is divided up into all these smaller Greek kingdoms. One of them is called the Seleucid Empire. And that's the one that takes control eventually of Judea and of Jerusalem and of the temple. And so they bring, Greek religious statues into the temple. They desecrate the temple. They outlaw traditional Jewish worship in Jerusalem and in Judea. Wow. And so eventually this family, the Maccabean family, it starts with the dad, and the dad dies and his son Judas takes over. They lead this revolt and they end up overthrowing the Seleucid Empire in Jerusalem, and they free Jerusalem. And so it's this great victory. They liberate it. There's actually, if you're from the Catholic tradition at all, there's a collection of books that's known as the Apocrypha.
Yeah.
And last time we talked, you went to Catholic school. So yes. Did you guys ever read the Apocrypha when you were in school?
I have, but not like really, any kind of detail or study. But yeah, it is sort of that like extra little collection of books between Old and New Testament that you're like, wow, there's some interesting titles in here of like certain books, right?
Yeah, if you were to get a Bible from the Catholic tradition, the Apocrypha is in there. You can buy copies of the Apocrypha at any bookstore or Amazon. And it's this collection of books that for Catholic people, they consider it part of what's known as the canon, like it's a part of the Bible. But in the Protestant tradition, no one necessarily denies the history that's in it. It's just not considered like authoritative. But in those apocryphal books, in the book of First Maccabees, it talks about when the success of the Maccabean revolt, and in First Maccabees 13:51, it describes how Judah Maccabees leads his army, which was known as the Hammer. He leads them into Jerusalem after the success of the revolt. And this is actually what it says. I'll just read it. It says, on the 23rd day of the second month in the 171st year, the Jews entered it with praise and palm branches, and with harps and cymbals and stringed instruments, with hymns and songs, because a great enemy had been crushed and removed from Israel. So this is what's describing the victory parade as Judah Maccabees leads his army into Jerusalem to celebrate their victory, to kind of restore, the temple, to restore traditional Jewish worship. And so there's palm branches and everything. And palm branches at that point become a symbol of victory. The Maccabees eventually Jerusalem is retaken again, but for this brief period of time, because of the Maccabean revolt, it's free. They actually mint coins that have palm branches on them. Okay. Just as it becomes this symbol of victory. Wow. And so the fact that Jesus rides in on this royal animal and he's greeted in a way that's like reminiscent of of this important event, this fairly recent. I mean, when you talk
Yeah.
about history, 150, 160 years isn't that epic of
Wow.
an amount of time. And so it's reminiscent. So really they're asking him to essentially do the same thing. Hey, what Maccabees did, we want you to do the same thing. We want you to be our king. We want you to lead a revolt. We want this to be victorious. So it really is a symbolic event. And
Hmm.
Jesus is well aware of that. Jesus is aware of that. The crowd is aware of that. Jesus' followers are aware of that. Like there's no mystery behind what's happening.
Wow.
Everybody gets it.
Wow. Oh, that's fascinating. So, I mean, we have this scene that we're reading in. It happens in a lot of different parts of the Gospels. Matthew 21 is one place that we find this scene unfolding, and so we're kind of reading this and seeing Jesus do this. And as you're unpacking that, there are a lot of interesting things. You know, the palm branches, the donkeys, but then to hear the history behind that and sort of how everyone was interpreting that, basically thinking that Jesus was going to do the same thing that was done before, right? That he is sort of ushering in this new revolt, and they're like, all right, cool, we're gonna get rid of the Romans again, and Jesus, you're leading the way. Wow, that's a crazy thing.
Yeah, and what's really even more interesting about it is what Jesus does next, because
Mm.
one of the things Maccabees does after he frees Jerusalem is he cleanses the temple. Because when the Seleucids were in control, like I said, they brought pagan Greek images into the temple, and it was considered like desecrated. And so before the Jews could, start worshiping their God in there again in the traditional Jewish way, they had to cleanse the temple and they had to purify it.
Mm.
So Jesus, when he comes riding into town on Palm Sunday, and he's greeted in this, this victory parade where people are cheering for him, pretty much what he does pretty quick is he goes to the temple, and he has really what's one of the most famous encounters of his at the temple that people talk about all the time, because it's in some ways it seems uncharacteristic of Jesus.
Mm.
What he does when he goes to the temple, because usually when you think of Jesus, you get this image of he's this loving, kind, gentle, calm person, and
Yes.
even when there's all kinds of chaos, and even when people are rude and mean to him, he always responds with gentleness and with love.
He seems
But
very zen sometimes, right? Like
yeah,
when you read about it, he's just always at peace, you know?
yeah, but not when he goes to the temple this time,
Mm.
because he goes into the temple, and again, you can read about it in a few of the Gospels. Matthew talks about it. What all Matthew tells us is he chases out the money changers and like overturns their tables.
Just throwing tables. He's like the
Yeah,
whip. Is that the part where he has like the whip and he's just, yeah, wow,
yeah, and
driving
it's
people
weird
out?
because it's not a long story in the Gospels. It's just a few sentences. He goes in, he uses the whip, he overturns the tables, he drives the money changers out, and then it like goes on.
Mm.
But when you look at those verses, it's like, wow, like what, like what is it that drove him to do that? Because again, it seems so uncharacteristic of him.
Mm.
But I think when he does that, I mean, Jesus is smart. He knows what he's doing.
Right.
He everything he does is intentional. He has a reason behind it, and so him going to the temple again in a lot of ways continues on the Maccabean theme of we're here to purge the temple, like we're here to cleanse the temple.
Mm.
And so I think his going to the temple and his responding the way he does, I think there's a couple things that are going on there, a couple pretty significant things. One is just when you look at like the actual layout of the temple, like if you were to, you can Google, this temple is known as Herod's temple because
Mhm.
King Herod's the guy who really built it. It's a huge structure, but there's a lot of corruption going on with the money changers,
Mm.
because the biggest part of the temple is what's known as a court of the Gentiles, and it's like the outer court, and it's the only place Gentiles were allowed to go in the temple. There was an inner court that was known as where Jewish people could go, but even that, there was a court of the women, and Jewish women had to stop, and then Jewish men could go further, and then there was a place that only the high priest could go.
Mhm.
um, so it's just basically the more holy you are, the closer toward
Closer
God's
to the
room you can
inside.
get.
Yeah.
It's kind of how it works. And so they've taken this court of the Gentiles, the only place that Gentiles can go in the temple, and they've turned it into a market, which is bad enough, but then they're also ripping people off. So
Mm.
like when you come to the temple, one of the things you're coming to do is to offer a sacrifice. And so depending on what type of sacrifice, I mean, the Old Testament lays out a pretty thorough sacrificial system for, I'm doing a guilt sacrifice or a fellowship. There was all these kinds of different sacrifices, and that would determine what animal you would buy. And so the money changers in the temple, the only animals you could sacrifice in the temple, you had to buy in the temple, and they hiked the price way up from what you could buy them for in town. So, we don't know exactly what the numbers were, but, let's say you were sacrificing a dove or something. It's like, hey, you can buy a dove in town for $10, but if you go to the temple, it's going to cost you $100. And by the way, if you want to get the sacrifice so that you can be cleansed and be right with God, you have to use ours. So they're ripping people off. They're taking advantage of people. They're stopping Gentiles from actually worshiping God. So on one hand, you see the corruption that this is ultimately what makes Jesus angry. It's not just that there's some people think it's like, oh, he's mad that there's transactions in the I don't think he's super upset that there's transactions at all in the temple. It's just the nature of it and what it's doing to people. That you're getting rich, you're ripping people off, and you're keeping people from connecting with God. And so that's on one hand the background of it, but I think the actual action of what Jesus does, I think really in a lot of ways, and I have a graduate school professor who talked a lot about this, that it's Jesus condemning the whole temple system. That his actions are, hey, this system as a whole has failed. And so in the same way that, if you go back to Maccabees kind of like cleanse it. And I don't remember exactly. I don't even know if we have the details of it. I don't know exactly what Maccabees does when he cleanses the temple, but he purifies it in order to bring people back to God. And so in a sense, that's kind of what Jesus is doing, but Jesus has no intention of restarting the temple system. That's basically his judgment of it that says it's done.
It's ending, with his arrival. And I know that in Matthew's account.
Yeah, go ahead.
He is referencing a passage from, I believe it's Jeremiah, where he talks about, the temple's not going to be a den of robbers, but a house of prayer. And so he kind of is like connecting their story, their understanding of what the temple is, and sort of saying, hey, you get this, and this is what it's evolved into. And now, look what I'm doing is I am reinterpreting that and cleansing it.
Yeah. Because then Jesus, one of the things he gets in trouble for when he gets arrested is what he says about the temple and his comments about the temple and how you can tear it down and the temple's not going to be here much longer. And, Jesus, he ends up dying. This whole last week of his life is somewhere around 30, CE, give or take a few years, could be 33, something like that. Yeah. And the temple gets destroyed in 70 and is never rebuilt again.
So not that far off. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're not, and Jesus obviously knows that and he sees that coming. But for Jewish people living in Jerusalem, it's still like the center of life. Like everything revolves around the temple. And so for him to kind of make these criticisms about the temple, it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah. Wow. So when all this is happening, I mean, the triumphal entry of Jesus on the donkey, the palm branches, then him going into the temple and saying all these things. I mean, as we kind of look at like the first century world of the disciples, and then just also kind of the Jewish understanding of that, they probably didn't fully get what Jesus was saying or doing. Like they're a little confused. I mean, the disciples were thinking that he was going to lead a revolt or rebellion against Rome, and then he died. So I mean, there's a lot that they miss. A lot of their own messianic like ideas of what was going to happen were not that way in Jesus, but he was fulfilling them. He was fulfilling them, just not in a way that they were expecting.
Yeah. And it's, we'll talk about this more, even probably in our next podcast, but you can tell that by certain responses. I mean, so much of what happens in the Last Supper and everything is Jesus talking, and it's what Jesus does. But there's these little snippets of when Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter pulls out a sword and he's ready to attack someone. Even after Jesus' resurrection in the book of Acts, his apostles ask him, now are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And even just the crowd. I mean, you look at it on Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry, the crowd's cheering for him. A week later, the same crowd of people is going to chant for his death, his crucifixion.
Yeah. Wow.
So it's like it may not be necessarily blatant in there, but you can look throughout that whole narrative of the last week of Jesus' life, what he's doing, what he's saying, because Matthew includes a big chunk of all these parables that
Mhm.
Jesus tells in the last week of his life. And people just, they're not getting it. Jesus isn't doing what they want him to do. He's not doing what they think he's going to do. He's doing the complete opposite. And yeah, no, you're right. Exactly. Exactly. You said nobody gets it. The apostles don't get it. The people don't get it.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's such a fascinating part of scripture, and I encourage anyone who's listening to, spend some time reading through that, kind of read through it slowly, and sort of read about all of those parables that Jesus tells, because after the triumphal entry and after he goes in the temple, he does have sort of some longer kind of teaching segments. And we find that in Matthew's gospel and in John's, it seems like so much of that gospel is just focused on this final week of Jesus's life. And then we arrive um, at a time that we call like the Last Supper, communion. Really, they're celebrating Passover is what's happening, and you find this in Matthew 26. You also find it in the other Gospels as well. And there's so much here, and we'll talk a little bit more kind of about Jesus' death and what that meant in our next episode. But as we kind of just approach the Last Supper, there's obviously huge connections here between what Jesus is doing and Passover. Could you say a little bit about like why that's significant, why Jesus chose Passover to now be this time where he talked about this kind of this new religious meal that people would have, and communion, and just sort of how it is all connected?
Yeah. Passover, the important thing to understand about Passover is it's a very specific, like scripted out meal.
Hmm.
So Passover in itself, like the whole celebration, it would go on for longer than it was like a week long festival or so. But there was one that was like, this is the Passover meal, and this is what Jesus is sharing with his followers when they do the when they do the Last Supper. Which, first of all, I think one thing that's easy for us to miss is Passover is a family celebration. You would
Mm.
celebrate it with the family, because even when you go through the Passover meal, there's parts for everyone in the family to play. Like the
Right.
dad does stuff, the mom does stuff, the kids. So it's a family meal. So the fact that Jesus is celebrating it with his apostles tells you something about the nature of the way Jesus viewed his movement that would eventually become the church.
Wow. Yeah.
That it's, I mean, because one of the metaphors the New Testament writers will use is that the church is the family of God.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that Jesus celebrates this Passover with his people, with his followers. That
Yeah.
it's that I think there's deep significance there. And so they're celebrating this family meal together. And again, every part of the Passover meal is symbolic.
Mm.
Like the food you would eat, the order you would eat it in, the way that you do it. There was multiple times that you would take a cup and you would lift it up as like a cheers, and each one signified something. And again, it was all celebrating the story of the Exodus,
Mm.
and the experience of the Israelite people in slavery, and ultimately God's deliverance of them through Moses. Um, and the main course, if you will, of the Passover was lamb, and that was significant
Mm.
because in the Passover story, the last kind of what ultimately frees the people is what's known as the plague of death, or sometimes people call it the angel of death,
Hmm.
and death kind of passes over the land of Egypt. But then the Israelites were to slaughter a lamb and use its blood to paint their doorpost. So
Hmm.
when the angel of death came over, if it saw the blood on the doorpost, it would pass over their house, nothing would happen, and it would go on to the next one. And so the whole idea of the lamb and of blood is incredibly, again, it's significant.
Mm.
And like we said before, it's their national holiday. This is what celebrates like their founding as a people, their defining event. Again, it would be for us like the 4th of July. Like here's where we became a people.
Mm.
And so what Jesus does, again, I think for those of us that don't come, myself included, that don't come from a Jewish background, it's really easy to miss like how powerful and in some ways disrespectful it is what Jesus does on the Passover.
Mm. Yeah.
Because he gets to this point where he's taking bread, and there is a point in the Passover where you would take bread and you would break it, and the bread is literally known as the bread of affliction. I mean, that's what it's called in the Passover, and part of it is to remember the suffering of Egypt. In Egypt, it's the bread is unleavened, which means it's flat, it didn't rise, And again, that's symbolic because in the Exodus story, the people of Israel had to leave Egypt so quick, they didn't have time for their bread to rise.
Good rise, yeah.
And so you're taking this bread that is symbolic of the suffering, the 400 years that the Israelites suffered oppression in Egypt. And that's what it's celebrating. And it's remembering their suffering and the freedom that they got. And Jesus takes the bread and he breaks it and he says, "This now is my body that's broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." So on one hand, he keeps the theme of suffering. Like, hey, in the past, this bread was meant to resemble the suffering of all these slaves under Egyptian oppression. But now, from now on, it's going to remind you of my suffering that he hasn't endured yet, but he will very shortly on the cross. And so I have to imagine for the apostles that are there, like how uncomfortable that would be.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Never thought of it that way.
Yeah, because it's like you're I've said it before that it would literally be like if I got together with my family for 4th of July and we're getting ready to light off fireworks in the front of the house, and I just said, hey, as I know in the past we've lit these off to celebrate those brave men and women who fought in the Revolutionary War and gave us freedom, but this year we're going to celebrate my accomplishments in my life. As we light off these fireworks, just remember everything. Like,
yeah.
No, it would be weird. Or the other one I say too is we have a big 4th of July parade here in Huntington Beach. And so it's like, there's all these floats that go down, and it would be like if you made a float to yourself.
You became Uncle Sam. And
yeah. So it's like, here comes the Stephen Pate float, and it was just filled with facts about yourself and all your personal accomplishments, and it celebrated you. I mean, people would look at you and be like, what is wrong with this guy? This is about, but because normally you put, red, white, and blue on it, and you celebrate some aspect of, so it's kind of bold. Now, Jesus goes on with that because then it says immediately after dinner, there's different, like I said, there's different toasts you would give during the Passover meal. The one that comes right after dinner is what's known as the cup of redemption. And so you're celebrating the fact that you were redeemed, and ultimately redemption is about paying the price. It's about buying freedom. And in the Exodus story, that's again the lamb died so that you wouldn't have to, and that's what the blood was about. And Jesus takes it and says, this cup of redemption, this is my blood that's going to be poured out for you, so do this in remembrance of me.
Wow.
Which I think for Jewish men in the first century, I think that's weird on a couple instances. One is again, he's hijacking the national holiday and he makes it by himself. The other is, if you know anything about Jewish food laws, the one thing you avoid above everything else is blood. Like, that's all over the Jewish food laws. Like, don't eat the blood, don't eat the blood. But Jesus literally is like, hey, this is my blood, pass it around, and everybody, take a drink.
Right.
Like, even just the concept, even though like, okay, I know it's not actually his blood, but he wants us to symbolically drink something that resembles his blood. So it's powerful what Jesus does there, because he changes the meaning of Passover completely. And really, in a lot of ways, what he's attempting to do and what he does is ultimately he changes the focus of the story of God. And for us, we might even say he changes the focus of the Bible.
Yeah.
Because I think the argument could be made that up to that point, faith in God was based on the Exodus. That whenever people talked about God, we always looked back on, why do we trust God? Why do we hope in God? Why? Because look what he did in the Exodus. And even when things get bad, even, during the exile or other things, we always have this, hey, God did this in the Exodus and he'll do it again. That was really the foundation of faith.
Yeah.
Even though, there's Genesis, there's creation, there's Abraham, there's all that stuff. But Exodus for the nation of Israel, that was kind of the foundation. And so that's why Passover was so important. So what Jesus does isn't just about changing a holiday, but he's literally like altering the center of God's work. And he's saying, hey, the Exodus was great and everything, but now God's work, what he's been up to, it's no longer centered around the Exodus. It's centered around me and my death and my resurrection. And that's huge.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just like, oh, I'm doing something a little different. It's like, no, we are changing the focus of what it is that God is doing in the world. And it doesn't take away the significance of the Exodus in one sense. But again, faith from that point on is not Exodus centric anymore.
Yeah.
Now it centers on Jesus' death and resurrection. And so I think like it's just heavy. It's like a heavy, powerful, weird, heretical, blasphemous, disrespectful. Like there's all I just sometimes try to imagine what it was like to be one of the apostles, a Jewish man in the room, and just watch this whole thing go down and be like, what is happening?
Yeah. Seriously. And just trying to comprehend that as Jesus is now basically describing a new Exodus through him, right? Like through him, there is now this new path of freedom, and it's not being delivered from slavery in Egypt, but now it's delivering, you from death and from sin. And I imagine as you're describing this, and you think about the the apostles that are sitting there just like, what is he saying? That, yeah, they thought that until they met him after the resurrection. Then they're like, oh, I get it. He really did the thing he said he was going to do.
Yeah, because again, even at that point, during the Last Supper, when Jesus talks about him, he's going to die. The apostles are still like, no, like that's not how. And even he even tells them, I was like, yeah, you guys are going to deny me. And Peter's like, no, I'll never deny you.
Right.
Like, so again, even at that point, I mean, who knows what they actually think, what they actually believe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at that point, I'm sure some of them are maybe inspired by what he's saying, even if they don't understand it. Others of them are probably like, man, maybe we picked the wrong guy. This dude's a little out. Like, who knows what their actual, but yeah, they're still not fully understanding, like you said, until later.
Yeah.
Like until after the resurrection, then it's like, okay, I get it now.
Mm-hmm. Because there are other, people who claim to be messiahs or other, those types of figures. And when they died, well, their movement fell apart. Like, it was gone. And so it's like, well, if our leader is going to die, well, then everything that we've been doing, it's for nothing. And so, again, just kind of missing, that huge piece that eventually are going to experience, and that would change everything for them. Yeah. Change everything for us.
Mm-hmm. Oh. Yeah, I mean, I would even argue that not only does it change biblical history, it changes history.
Yeah.
Like Jesus is literally, because a lot of times, when people talk about Christianity, when people talk about faith, like they'll start with arguing about creation.
Mm-hmm.
Creation versus the Big Bang or whatever. And I'm not saying creation's unimportant. I'm not saying creation doesn't matter, but like Jesus, and you see it here at the Last Supper, like he centers basically all of human history around his death and his resurrection.
Yeah.
That's what matters more than anything. That's the center of all of it. That's the center of human history. That's the center of what God is doing. Like that's the basis of it. And that's really ultimately what the Christian worldview is based around. It's based around the idea of death and resurrection, and that life comes from death. And again, it's not to discount creation or the Exodus or any other parts of the Bible that happened before or after that, but that's the center of it. To me, that's what really Jesus does at the Last Supper, is center everything around his death and ultimately his resurrection.
Wow. I love that. Thank you so much, Scott, for unpacking that. And there's so much more to say, and we're going to keep talking a little bit about this final week of Jesus' life, Holy Week, and look at a couple other significant events that take place. But as we kind of wrap up, could you maybe just kind of share just a takeaway for someone listening, and maybe they're participating in Lent in some fashion, or they're just maybe thinking about what Jesus did, or just contemplating this, and just maybe a couple things that we could maybe think through, pray through as we just continue to make this journey towards Easter?
Yeah. The thing that I'm always reminded of at this point, that always is in some ways it's convicting to me, in some ways it's challenging, in some ways it's really encouraging, is, we've talked about how essentially at the Last Supper, Jesus is rewriting history. That's what he's doing. He's changing the focal point of history. But he does it at this meal with his followers, who are up to this point incredibly flawed people. Like that's the funny thing about the Gospels when you read the stories of the apostles, is even though two of them are written by apostles. Mm-hmm. I mean, Matthew and John are apostles, like, and even Mark and Luke, they're friends with apostles. Like the Gospels don't paint the apostles in the best light. Like, they're
True.
flawed people. They say things wrong. They do things wrong. They don't understand. Acts is a little bit different story. Acts and the rest of the New Testament, they finally start to get it. They kind of become these heroes. But they're these incredibly flawed people. And still, Jesus invites them to be a part of his family
Mm.
and to share in this moment with him. That's, as a church, we celebrate communion.
Mhm.
And communion is based on what happens at the Last Supper. And we talk about this sometimes when we do it at church. It's hard to celebrate communion during the pandemic. And so we've had to find different ways to do that. But one of the things we say sometimes when we celebrate communion at church is that this is a family meal. And again, in Jesus' world, eating with someone was a sign of social acceptance.
Mhm.
That if I was willing to eat with you, I accepted you. And if I didn't accept you, I would never eat with you. And Jesus invites everyone to his family table. Like, there's no one, Jesus doesn't, he doesn't look at him and say like, oh no, you're broken, you're too messed up, you're too flawed, you don't understand what I'm saying, you don't fully get it. Like, there's no prerequisite. There's no, hey, you have to have it all together. A lot of times people will point to Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 talks about communion.
Mhm.
And one of the things he says, don't take it in an unworthy manner. And if you do, you drink judgment upon yourself. And some people think that has to do with sin, but it's interesting because if you look at it, Paul's writing that in the context of unity. And so the issue of drinking it in an unworthy manner has nothing to do with my sin or lack of sin. It has everything to do with my relationship with other people. Like, if I'm somehow doing something that causes division or brings hurt into the community of God's people, into the church, then I better watch it, because this is a family meal. And so it's this reminder to me that no matter who we are, no matter who you are, that God invites us to his family.
Mm.
And that's comforting on one hand, and it's also challenging on another hand. Because then I have to wonder, are there people that I try to exclude from God's family?
Mm.
Because there's something that I don't like about them. Because there's something that and it could be anything. It could be a behavior, could be a lifestyle, it could be the fact they hurt me in the past.
Mhm.
Could just be they root for the wrong sports team. Or, I mean, there's 1,000 different reasons. But if God accepts me and all my brokenness, how do I do the same? And I think that honestly is a big part of preparing our heart for Lent, is really looking at, who are the people in my life that maybe I put up barriers to them experiencing Jesus. And what can I do to make sure that they know that they're welcomed at God's table? That's, I think, like I said, that's a big part of the heart of Jesus. It's what he's doing as he judges the temple and in some ways condemns the temple as he goes to the cross, is making a way possible for us to experience God and inviting us. Really, he's inviting us into the story. I mean, that's what it is. Like you said, it's a new Exodus, and he's inviting us to be a part of it. And so how are we, one, are we responding to that with gratitude? And
Mm.
two, are we helping other people to experience that same grace that God gives them? So that would be my
Yeah.
encouragement for us.
I love that, Scott. Thank you so much. And that is that's an incredible thing to reflect on. That's a challenge for all of us to think through as we approach Easter with gratitude for what Jesus has done, and also as we look out in our lives and think of those that we need to welcome to the table, because there's always an open seat at Jesus' table, and that's an amazing thing to hold on to. Well, thank you so much for walking through that and helping us find all those different messages in the text of scripture. That's what this podcast is all about. And I really enjoyed this conversation. And thank you everyone who's listening or watching. We just appreciate you checking this out, and we look forward to hanging out next time. We'll do part 2 of Holy Week, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But thanks again so much for being here. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and God bless, grace and peace.
Yeah. Hey, thank y'all so much for hanging out. Love y'all. Stephen, good to see you again, man. Have a
Good to see you
great
too, man.
day.
All right, you take care. Talk to you later.
See you guys.